Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Community Conversations as we discuss instructional strategies for the online teaching. I'm Dr. Jerusalem Rivera Wilson with the School of Education. I'd like to share with you a few items in reference to Remote ED. Remote ED has over 1,500 free educational resources, and it can be found at remoteed.org. Academy for the Advancement of Teaching Leadership in Schools is part of the Remote ED program. So please follow us on Facebook or on Twitter, as we will be promoting all future community conversation events and additional events sponsored and supported by the School of Education. Next on Community Conversations is esports program with K-12 schools and universities, and that will be on September 23rd. On September 30th, we will be doing Grading for Equity, Rethinking Grades in K-12 Schools with Joe Feldman. If you're interested in receiving continuing teacher and leader education credit, please visit Community Conversations at Remote ED, and there are steps that one needs to follow in order to be eligible. And now I'm going to turn it over to today's presenters and facilitator, Dan Phan, Senior Director of Digital Learning at Cognia. Dan?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me today. My name is Dan Phan, and I serve as the Senior Director of Digital Learning Services with Cognia. My background is in mathematics education, and I've had the privilege of working in the online industry for about 10 years now as a ghostwriter and a curriculum developer as well. I'm here and excited to really learn more about some of the theories and practices from our distinguished panel of guests here today. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Chris Harrington here.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm Chris Harrington. I'm the director of Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute, and we focus on providing formal research for the K-12 education community within the state of Michigan, but also beyond. We really like to emphasize our research in a way that is consumable by practitioners. And I myself have been a teacher for 11 years, a central office administrator leading digital learning programs for 15 years. And I provide consulting services across the country, helping schools implement programs like the kind we're talking about today. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Nicole, if you don't mind.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Reeves. I am from way down south in Louisiana, and I am not swimming in Hurricane Laura waters. I am well, but I've been in education for 29 years now, most of it as, about half of it as a teacher and half as an administrator. But I've been working with Cognia for going on 5 years, where we work with teachers in practical application of instructional strategies and school leaders about strategic thinking and planning. So we're all things professional services and improving the teaching and learning in schools. And my work is with staff specifically and applying best practices.
Wonderful. And Dr. Peter Shea.
Hi, thanks, Dan. I'm Peter Shea. I'm a professor in the School of Education here at the University of Albany. I think Jerry roped me into participating in this panel because of my background in research on online teaching and learning. I've been doing research since the late 90s on how students succeed in online courses, how faculty respond and design instruction for online learning, how to develop communities of inquiry in online environments, and understanding for whom online learning is a good fit and for whom it may not be the best fit, and ways to address challenges that students experience in online environments. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we're looking forward to this rich conversation here. And so we're going to actually just jump right into some of the guiding questions here. And I think the conversation is going to be really trying to balance both the theoretical and the application here. So we're going to jump right in with the first question, which is what are some strategies and tips that K through 12 teachers can use in the online environment here? And so Chris, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you first here.
Sure, absolutely. I think one of the things that I'd like to mention before I really dive into that answer is, we're living in a time right now where a lot of us have been pushed into remote teaching and learning. And just to clarify that, what we commonly refer to as virtual learning or quality online learning programs isn't necessarily what a lot of us are experiencing right now. But regardless, some of these strategies and tips apply. No matter if it's a very mature, well-planned virtual learning course, or if it's something that is just stood up pretty quickly. But I think one of the things that one of the strategies that I think would be very wise for all teachers when providing an online experience for kids and developing this environment is make sure that the tools and the resources being used are age appropriate, and that the tools and resources students are familiar with. And if they're not, there needs to be some sort of direction or guidance, like maybe an orientation to how to be a virtual learner and how to function or navigate within a course. But then there's some other things that I think we might take for granted, but they're really emphasized or amplified within an online course. And that's clarity of instructions, especially if you're working in an asynchronous environment where students are mostly working independently. Having clarity of instructions is really, really important, but then also the communication pieces that go along with that between teacher and student. And just like in a face-to-face classroom, the development of relationships with students, I mean, that's what education is, right? The computer's not going to do all the teaching. The content's not going to do all the teaching. It's developing the relationships with the kids. That's super important. Get to know them and let them get to know you. And I guess another piece there would be the parents or the guardians, the family that's supporting the child at home or wherever they're learning virtually, partnering with those parents wherever possible.
Fantastic. Nicole, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to chime in next. Sir.
Sure. I agree with Christopher when we say that you have to know it's not only difficult for the teachers, it's also difficult for students who may be unfamiliar with software, but so are teachers. So the trick for me is that that I'd like to share with teachers is that you've got to start simple, and you have to start with something you're very familiar with in your wheelhouse, or you cannot guide students through using different software or different online learning tools or whatever the case may be. So start simple, choose one, practice, and help your children or your students practice so that everybody can engage fully. So one of the things that I've seen done to do that is teachers will take the first day of instruction, maybe the first 15 minutes, and introduce that and use that one tool for the whole week. But it depends on the teacher. But the instructional strategies that worked in concept in a face-to-face learning situation should be also done online. Student engagement is very, very important. And it's hard to keep students engaged in an online setting if you're not familiar with different opportunities or ways to do that. Some of the things that have been very helpful for teachers are to use instructional videos, where a student can watch that before coming to class so that the teachers can engage them into different activities. Or even if the teacher uses or creates a screencast and is presenting that, the teacher can monitor the faces of the students. If they're using their cameras, the teacher can stop it from time to time and use drawing tools or cursors or pointers to kind of facilitate discussion. So that's just a real practical application. But again, know the platforms, know the software, and make sure you know what the school is going to allow as well in terms of finding online resources, because you have to teach your students where to go and to find credible sites and use tools that don't get them access to things they shouldn't have.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. Shea?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I would just reinforce what Chris and Nicole had to share. At a practical level, I think instructional design for online learning is maybe even more important than it is for classroom learning, because everything has to sort of be ready to go before you start teaching. The materials need to be in place. Students need to know kind of everything. You need to be done before you start, in a sense, and that's not a great set of conditions for where we are now in a pandemic. So I think one of my first pieces of advice is be kind to yourself, be caring to yourself, and be kind and caring to your students, because that's what this situation requires of us. To the greatest extent possible, you want to have a well-developed orientation and syllabus section for an online course, so students can really sort of navigate their way through the term and understand what's expected of them. Realize that students really need a lot of structure, and that structure can help both with sort of your day-to-day classroom management, but also helping students navigate through the course. Students need a sort of a set schedule of an understanding of when activities are going to occur. If you're going to have synchronous activities, really that needs to be outlined well in advance so students can plan for being involved in synchronous distance activities. And they need a schedule for asynchronous activities as well, really driving home again and again the due dates, the deadlines, the structure for online learning is crucial for negotiating meaning in the absence of face-to-face interaction, or a lot of face-to-face interaction. And one thing that I would just recommend is that you get classrooms where there's a lot of participation among a very few students and less participation among some students, and using asynchronous discussion activities really can help draw out students who might not be otherwise willing to participate. So think about asynchronous threaded discussion as an opportunity to sort of democratize the classroom. One final little tip for folks who are thinking about this is that students are going to have questions about how they're going to succeed and what they need to do. And in this learning environment, maybe it's Google Classrooms, maybe it's another tool that your school uses, but create an ask a question area where students can get that kind of public support from either you or from other students for frequently asked questions. Those just, a few tips and strategies that I think can help get things underway.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And I think this is a wonderful continuation of our previous discussion as well, too, in that we have to kind of have compassion at first, right? I think that's, we're in unprecedented times right now, and compassion is definitely needed all around. I think that's always one of the things that we at Cognia here preach when we are talking about the accreditation process, that schools really need to have compassion, and we as a accreditation agency are there to really talk about compassion is first and foremost, do no harm to the institution, and really be able to help everyone sort of advance in this journey right here. One of the things that I think every single one of you have touched based on is really establishing a learning culture in the online environment. And I think that's absolutely instrumental on just from a in-person experience to that of an online. It's about those relationships, right? I'm going to conjure up my Taggart research here, rigor, relevance, and positive relationships, right? And so I think it's about fostering that culture. And so that's going to be my next question here that we would love to discuss here is what are some critical aspects of developing an online learning culture here? And Dr. Shea, if you don't mind, I'm going to start off with you and asking you to point out maybe some of the additional research and or some applications there, sir.
Yeah, well, thanks, Dan. I think in the same way that we think about face-to-face classrooms and the need to develop and foster a community of learners where there's a shared goal in learning and shared sense of purpose in learning, that needs to be sort of fostered and developed and facilitated in online environments. So trying to think about your role as an instructor, as a teacher, as being sort of an orchestrator of this, or a facilitator of this community of inquiry. That the research that I've done with my colleagues and published in numerous journals really talks to the importance of 3 different related forms of presence. If you can think about what can we do to create a presence in the absence of face-to-face interaction? There are different ways in which we can do that. There's this sort of notion of teaching presence, which is sort of the instructional design, the facilitation of productive discourse, and the provision of direct instruction. That's sort of the meat and potatoes of what teachers do on a day-to-day basis. But translating that in an online environment so that students understand what's expected of them and really begin to cohere as a community. For a community of learners to emerge, to some extent, students should feel that their success depends on what they do not only contributes to their own learning, but that it contributes to the learning of their peers and to other classmates. And your role in trying to facilitate this community of inquiry is to get students to understand we're all kind of in this together and we're working together, and to just, to rely on some collaborative learning techniques. But again, a lot of this depends on the orchestration of the instructor, this establishing of clear instructional design, facilitation of discourse, and provision of direct instruction. That depends on collaborative discourse through both synchronous and asynchronous, sort of open-ended discussions and instruction. There's also this sort of essential social dimension to learning that we have to recall. Students aren't just numbers, they're real people. And what we're trying to do is build and create a sort of a sense of positive affect and cohesiveness and collaboration that fosters that sense of learning community. Meaningful learning also stems from addressing significant problems and helping students understand where the instruction and where the content is important to them personally and in their personal lives. So those are sort of some conceptual kind of framing for how online learning can result in meaningful and substantive new understanding and creation of new knowledge.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, sir. Nicole, I'm going to turn it over to you here.
Yes, to me, the advice I have for building an online learning culture is that, first of all, I think I mentioned this last time, we have to engage ourselves in a shift in mindset. Many teachers in a face-to-face environment found themselves being true teachers and directing most of the learning. This is a great opportunity for teachers to become facilitators of learning. And so kind of like Dr. Shea said, there's an opportunity for teachers to allow students to co-create and to share in building what that classroom culture should look like. There's especially at the beginning of the school year, there's an opportunity for teachers to build that relationship and to talk to students about what their needs are, what their fears are, put that all on the line and make some clear expectations. What are their expectations and what are your expectations? And then that will kind of set the stage for the rest of the work that needs to happen. And just like in a regular classroom, there are processes and routines that need to be established. And so whatever the teacher decides to do, for example, if the beginning of the week, it cannot be the same as in a face-to-face learning environment where the teacher is doing the direct instruction or trying to draw a problem on the board or whatever. Students will be lost for sure. So it has to be very engaging from the get with content and videos or quotes or something, like Dr. Shea said, touches them where it means something in their personal lives or understanding. Also, they have to learn how to work independently. This is a very different thing. Students like to rely on the teachers for help. And in this kind of environment, they may or may not have the teacher's full assistance, but the teachers should, in part of the learning culture, have some time to set aside or some kind of, and I can talk about that later, manner in which they can at least talk to the students individually once a week. Also work to be independent from their parents as well. And then last, but certainly not least, help the students really become agents for their own learning. They are responsible. We cannot make a student learn, but we can encourage them and motivate them to move on to a new task if they've completed the tasks that have been set before them, to slow down when they need to be to slow down. So those are just some tips about how to make the online culture one of where they can share and how that's going to look.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nicole. Chris, we're going to turn it over to you, sir.
Sure. Nicole, I really appreciate how you emphasize the environment cannot be developed the same way that a face-to-face environment is. It is very different. You can have the same kind of rigor, the same content, the same skill development within a course, but how you go about structuring the course and that learning environment for kids. Dr. Shea, it's very different. Dr. Shea, I loved you were looking for the words. I always use the word of an architect. So the teacher becomes the architect of the student's learning experience, pulling in the pieces that are needed in order to make that child, give that child a pathway to be successful and to learn and develop the skills that they need. You know, I also strongly believe in the expectations piece in the very beginning, because setting this culture does require deliberate work. It doesn't just happen by itself. Even in a mature virtual learning program, it still has to be fostered and nurtured, but especially when being pushed into a remote teaching and learning environment caused by, say, a pandemic. You know, there are new skills and new ways of looking at things that we need to develop within our kids. And Dr. Shea mentioned something about all students contribute to the learning experience. You know, in addition to having some establishing norms and communication protocols for kids, having that accountability for and to each other is really, really important. As a learning community and a learning culture there, we need to feed off of each other's ideas and grow together with each other. And I think a lot of this can be done by the modeling of the teacher. So when we talk about expectations, we can talk about student expectations. Sure, that's going to be part of it. But we also need to talk about what are the expectations of the teacher. As a teacher, you need to communicate to your students what they can expect from you. And so if I'm a teacher and I say, I'm going to respond to all emails within 24 hours, I actually need to follow through with that. That's my accountability to my students. So that's all goes hand in hand with mutual respect between teachers and students. And I think these are things that we have to be particularly mindful of in a virtual environment where we may not need to focus on it so much because it looks and feels differently in a face-to-face environment.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chris. And I think those norms and I can use a really quick example of even some of the norms that we have to begin developing when we're not synchronously meeting on like a Zoom call here, right? I always call them sort of my professional learning environment, so to speak, right? I know that there's been a lot of press about it, but I think just having those expectations set at the very beginning is going to be instrumental, right? The way that you position your camera, what's the expectation of whether the camera should be on or off, muting, how does that work, and then having children who are moving into the online space due to the pandemic. One of the things that I thought was a great one was that even getting into the students should actually not just be rolling out of bed and hopping onto a video call. I know we're laughing at that, but that's so much true in the elementary level that sometimes even at the high school level. But at the elementary level, you want to be very cognizant of the communication or the message that's being conveyed when you are on camera in a synchronous environment there. So fantastic there. Let me see here. We're going to jump to the next one here. If possible, what is essential to keep in mind when establishing structures in the K-12 online community? Can you provide some examples? And I think you've begun talking about some of those needed structures that were going to be there. So if you can follow up with some more examples if possible there. And so I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Nicole, I think we're going to ask you to start this one here.
Okay, very good. One of the things that in creating a structure for online learning, if you think back to when we had to include digital standards in our regular face-to-face classrooms, we had very different levels of integration, of technology integration. And I think it was Dr. Quintadura, if I think I'm saying it correctly, who said, you know, first substitute, like instead of using your textbook, you are going to use you know, an online book, or you can highlight the book while you're reading if you have a digital book. But really we need to take that even further, where they can actually modify the whole lesson that the teacher would have done in a face-to-face environment. So instead of just highlighting the book, it might have been actual creating their version or summary in a storyboard, a digital storyboard or something of that nature, of course, depending on the age. But one of the things when they, whatever it is, when the teacher is being the architect, as Chris said, when the teacher is being the architect, it's very important that they think through how it's going to happen before they communicate the processes and the procedures to the students. Obviously, scheduling, those structures need to be less, not as long for the earlier childhood students, for early elementary. And then of course it can get increasingly more challenging in terms of time. But even for the older students, if you are lecturing or if you're getting into something that is a little bit longer, then you should stop probably every 3 to 5 minutes and let them respond and check in. So knowing what you need to teach, knowing how to create that curriculum.
Oops.
Oops, I think we lost
For
Nicole.
suitable to online learning. Can you hear me?
Yep, we
Okay.
lost you for a sentence.
Sorry. So getting them to making sure that you establish when things will happen, when things are due, how it will be assessed, how students will be paired, how students will be grouped. It doesn't have to be all up front, but lesson by lesson. And then again, try the instructional strategies, the pairing or the grouping. And then as students get more and more familiar, you can just, a teacher can just implement without too much difficulty. I also think that part of the structures, because everything will be online, there is some definite need for teaching digital citizenship. So, you know, how to be responsible in a digital society, making sure that they are going to the appropriate sites, how to protect themselves physically, psychologically, especially with all these other things going on. How to protect their identity and things of that nature. And that's not a bad thing to share with parents as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And Nicole, I believe that you're referring back to some of the research done back in the 90s, I believe, by Dr. Joan Hughes, who came up with the RAT model for technology integration, which talks about really the process of online learning, right? And then later on, the practitioner, Dr. Pendegwa, I believe it was, came up with the SAM-R model. And those are the two models of technology integration. RAT stands for replacement, amplification, and then T stands for transformative. SAM-R is the substitution, augmentation, modification, and then finally redefinition. And so those are some of the research behind the technology integration there, and that's fantastic there. And then I believe that you spoke beautifully about how to actually integrate and divide into small groups. And that's going to be a really great instructional strategy, I think, that at the elementary level has been done beautifully. And through advancement in technology, I think can be replicated to a certain extent with web conferencing and whatnot. And I've always shared that with my digital schools that, you know, have you considered really just doing that little breakout sessions and utilizing in a Zoom call here in this case, the Zoom breakout rooms, right? And really have smaller groups and really begin some of that collaborative nature there. So sorry, I just kind of went off there a little bit there. So Chris, I'm going to turn over to you.
Sure. Yeah, so I was thinking the age appropriateness is very, very important also. So a lot of times when schools are moving to an online platform for virtual learning, there's a temptation from the technology perspective to get one system, one solution that meets all the needs for online learning. I can tell you right now, Moodle might work well for high school, but I've tried to use it in a school district for the elementary level, and that's a really difficult thing. So that age appropriateness matters, and that includes the devices that the kids are going to be on as well. I think it's also important to keep in mind that, and Nicole alluded to this, this isn't a simple conversion of taking your face-to-face classroom structures that you have and moving them online. It's not a direct match saying, oh, I do it this way face-to-face, I can do it the same way online. It doesn't really work that way. So there has to be some thought to that and how that's going to work. And I think because the nature of students may very well, to a large extent, be working asynchronously, being independent and self-directed, I think it's super, super important that the structure and the design of courses and the whole learning experience for kids is very simple and very straightforward, and it's very clear and easy to understand. What we don't want is we don't want to have this excessive cognitive load of kids trying to figure out, where do I go to do this? I don't understand, and they're confused. And it starts, when kids are by themselves, a little bit isolated maybe from the teacher or the class, they're working on their own. It really starts to snowball on them. And then I think it becomes a problem, and it can really create some barriers for kids. And I guess your learning experiences that you design for kids, consistency is really, really important. And I'm thinking about, if I'm a fifth grade teacher and I'm creating and architecting my learning experience or my learning environment for my kids, what are the other fifth grade teachers doing? What are the other teachers doing in the school? If we're all doing things differently, and we have our course overview and our lessons and our activities and assessments in all these different places, that gets really hard for kids, especially when you get to the secondary level where you have so many more separate courses. So that can be a real challenge. So keep that in mind. You have to kind of work within the larger organization to make sure that consistency is there, that predictability of an experience. If I'm an online learner and I log into my course for the first time, and I see, okay, this is where everything is, I move to my next course, I would love to be able to see it look familiar. And then I can actually get on with my learning and not try to figure out the environment so much. So I think those kinds of things, the age appropriateness, the simplicity, and then also that consistency and predictability.
Thank you, Chris. Dr. Shea?
Yeah, I would really reinforce what Chris was just saying. I think, at the individual course level, consistency is important, but even be more, if possible, more important is having consistency between courses. I've worked with my own son, who's 16 in high school during the spring term, and looking at the variety of courses and structures that teachers really had very little time to develop and very little time to get in place, and sort of heroically did just the same, despite the fact they were under these incredible, scary situations. It was a challenge for everybody. It was a challenge for the instructors, it was a challenge for the students, it was a challenge for the parents to try to get our heads around all this. I think, again, we had a little bit more time over the summer to kind of develop structures and try to get things in place. But what Chris is saying is absolutely essential. When we teach a program at the University of Albany in the Department of Educational Theory and Practice called Curriculum Design and Instructional Technology, and that whole program is fully online. And the online practices that we follow are, all courses will have a modular structure, right? There's not going to be this sort of anything goes structure. And so students know from course to course, from semester to semester, that each of the courses is going to have a fairly familiar modular structure. There's going to be sort of an orientation and syllabus section to the course where students can get oriented to what they need to learn and how the learning will occur, what the expectations are of them, what the expectations are from the faculty. what technologies that they're going to need to be successful, what materials, content, books they're going to need to be successful. And then that orientation and syllabus section serves as sort of a narrative pathway through the modular design of the rest of the course. When we design courses, we create modules that can be based on various kind of organizing frameworks, but the modules should be consistent from from course to course, from module to module. A module can be based on themes, like big ideas that you want students to understand. It can be based on weeks, just a sort of a time orientation. It can be based on chapters in a book or other organizing frameworks, but you should have this modular structure where that content is nested. So there may be a module 1 with a particular title, theories and histories of online learning, for example. And then within that module, there's a module at a glance. There's readings, there are lectures and other instructional materials. And then inside the module, there's a section on assignments, a section on discussions, an ask a question section. But that kind of simple modular structure that provides this way for folks to understand, how am I going to do this? How is this going to work? And have it be consistent from semester to semester and from course to course. It really will help the students to be able to succeed. Whether the students are going to be participating in asynchronous or synchronous activities, I think having that anchor in a learning management system that allows all the materials to be visible for all the students helps them get a better sense of what's required. But that consistency is absolutely essential.
That's fantastic, sir. And I would just chime in here and add to that's one of the things that I can't reiterate enough in this transition, is that one of the things that I always go back to is my teaching days back at the in person, right, is that starting out as a rookie teacher, I really appreciated having a framework and a structure to anchor sort of how my consistent lessons are going to go, right? It's lesson planning 101, so to speak, right? And it's got to be some sort of framework, right? And in this particular case, it's the good old Madeline Hunter framework, right? You can almost just take it and put it into a template, and then from day to day, this is how my day is going to be structured, and then that provides that consistency that the students have, right? And that might be a really good strategy for you to start out in transitioning really a lot of your content into the online environment in that modular element that you spoke of, Dr. Shea, is just start out with a framework that it's either approved by your school or your district, however it is. For me, it's always been kind of Madeline Hunter, that goes back to way back yonder, beyond my days, I believe. However, it really starts out by, just the good old practices. And then from there, you can then tie into some of that technology integration. How then can you take that digitize content and really begin to add and modify it or enhance it, or however you want to do it. And again, it's about everything we've kind of talked about is taking in small chunks, right? Making sure that it's first and foremost available for the students, that the structure's all there. And that's the beauty of online learning, I think, is that at the end of it, is that when you actually walk into a learning management system, and this is something that I allude to and help guide our evaluators out there, is that when you look at a course in the learning management system, you have a huge advantage. You actually get to see really the design and what's going to be taught over the whole entire course of the year or semester right before your eyes. And it's about clicking where you want to go, right? It's almost like a time travel element there, which I think is a fantastic component. So I can't reiterate enough, and thank you very much for that consistency component. And then I think you have actually been really on target here in talking about the different and age appropriate groups here. So we're going to jump right into the next one, which is, can you give examples of assessment practices at the different grade levels, from the elementary to maybe middle, and then to the high school level as well too, that promotes really becoming a self-directed and, most importantly, equitable and fair. So Dr. Shea, I think we're back to you, sir.
So I think teachers who are on this webinar know what's age appropriate in terms of assessment. And I'm not going to presume to tell teachers how to assess learning. My background's in online learning and online instructional design and how students can succeed online. And I think regardless of what kind of assessment practices instructors are going to implement online, you have to realize that online learning, in the absence of some rigorous proctoring model, assessments are going to be probably open book, open notebook, potentially collaborative. So being aware of the potential for this, this situation allows folks to develop and design assessment practices that are more appropriate to a distance learning environment. And I think, one way to do that is to have smaller, more frequent assessments, more personalized assessments rather than high stakes testing. A lot of high stakes testing, unless there's been a significant organized proctoring solution that's been put in place that both teachers and students are aware of and understand, is not the best way to go for fully online teaching and learning. So, I think you can sort of offload some of the grading of papers by creating quizzes and other kinds of assessment that are automatically graded, but realizing that you're going to need to modify assessment practices so that they're more frequent, that they're lower stakes, and that they're more frequent and more individualized, I think is how I would frame it.
Fantastic, thank you. Nicole, perhaps you can touch base on the whole balance assessment system here.
Absolutely. We do offer a balanced assessment system where we do look at teachers need to be able to assess formatively during the instructional process, to do some bigger checks in an interim situation. And of course, there's the summative. And those, we kind of stick to the formative in this kind of new virtual learning for several of the teachers. So it's going to look very different. And I agree with Dr. Shea, it's not going to be your standard, take a chapter test after you finish chapter 3. This is, again, a perfect opportunity for teachers who do know their students, who do know their grade level, who do know age appropriateness, but it's also a time for teachers to help their students become self-directed in terms of assessing themselves. So using tools like timelines for completion of projects or assignments and checklists. The student knows when they are accomplishing certain tasks and how much longer they have. So again, they're self-assessing. And then they can also, if they're working as a team, or a pair or a group or however the case is, if you're going to be more collaborative, which you should, then the team knows what the expectations are. One of the things that I really suggest, because it also helps with meaningful feedback, which is another question that you guys are going to ask, but during the formative assessment process, teachers have to be able to somehow have a system for a check for understanding and a check for what the students can do. So it's what they know and it's what they can do. And so when teachers give meaningful feedback, not just a great job, but more of, I see you have 2 of the 3 main points in this story, but you're missing one. Can you go back and find it? Then they know they've got a way to improve their understanding, improve their learning. Well, students can do that for each other. So if a teacher is using a rubric, the students can take that rubric, use that same language, and give themselves, assess themselves on their work using that rubric and apply it. The teacher has to show them how. They can use that same rubric and assess each other's work. And then by the time the teacher gets it, several eyes have looked at it. And the students not only know the content, but they know how to evaluate the content and they know how to evaluate the task, which when you look at things and when one looks at things from an evaluative eye, it makes it more likely that they will be able to perform the task because they know what to look for. So in our balanced assessment offerings, we do have formative assessment student item sets through Cognia. So member schools can do that sort of thing. They're shorter and they are addressed they address key standards. So that's another thing that schools and instructional coaches need to be sure is they need to maybe not have so many standards, but make sure they're prioritizing the most critical ones so that the learning can be deeper and more meaningful and can be easily transferable. And so if you assess on less standards, then you have an opportunity to do a better job, and shorter, more frequent.
And we'll be sure to add the link for some of our upcoming webinars that are open to the public in regards to our assessment literacy. I know we're doing a series upcoming here, Nicole, so we'll be sure to add that onto the webpage here so that we can make sure that everyone has access to that. Chris, if you don't mind, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think what Nicole outlined right there is really, really important because it hits on so many pieces of instructional best practices, whether you're teaching in a face-to-face or an online environment. The kinds of things Nicole was talking about with the formative assessments, the summative assessments, how they relate to each other, and how you get kids working together and kind of stepping up and owning some of the process, that's just good instruction, right? And you know, it does feed right into the assessment pieces. So the design of instruction and the assessment practices, they go hand in hand. You know, we know that. I'll get a little more granular when we talk about the formative assessments. And as Dr. Shea mentioned, you know, you can't have your big summative assessments being what they are in a face-to-face environment. The unit test, for example. You know, anywhere you can have answers that can just be Googled or students sharing answers, you know, you're just asking for trouble there. So you have to change that. And I'm working with some schools right now as they're launching their school year, and they're asking questions like, well, what does our instructional time look like? And when we get around to the assessment pieces, we start looking at, okay, have a lot of formative assessments. And the formative assessments can do a couple different things because teachers are worried also about students being disengaged or maybe not connecting during synchronous times, if there's some. You can have some things like polling in the middle of a synchronous lesson, or even put some links in the chat to some short online forms, maybe through Google Forms or maybe through Microsoft Forms, whatever the case may be. But anything that is small, short, quick hitter kinds of formative assessments or engagement points for students, not only does it keep them engaged, but can also provide meaningful feedback for the teacher and give the teacher an idea of whether or not students are getting this content. Another good example of that would be like an exit ticket. Okay, that requires the engagement, but depending on how that exit ticket is structured, it can actually provide some data to the teacher as to whether or not the students are understanding. And then when it comes to the summative assessments, if you have more formative assessments, then there tends to be less of a reliance on your summative assessments to really verify students' understanding. So it's kind of more of a summative assessment can be more of a cross-check and a validation of what was learned in the formative assessments. So and when it comes to the summative assessments, that's where you can start to play to learner strengths. So you could have students write an essay. It could be a presentation, something more creative, maybe a drawing. Any way you look at it, these summative assessments can be pulling together all the smaller chunks that were formatively assessed. And now, like I said, can be that validation piece.
Fantastic. That's wonderful and great advice there, sir. Right now, if you don't mind, what we're going to do is skip to the questions and comments section, and according to best practices as outlined by Chris there, if you do have some questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat box there for all of us to see, and then we'll make sure that we'll address it. The other one is that we'll send a reminder here that we do have another set of guiding questions, and we're hoping that based upon your feedback that you would like to have another session with us to tackle some of those questions there. And so that we do have another set, but in the best interest of time right now, we like to hear some of your questions and perhaps comments. And if you don't mind, go ahead and post them in the group chat there so that way we can see it. Or if you can, I'm not sure if we're able to have you raise your hands, and then we'll go ahead and unmute you or unmute yourself and ask a question of our panel here. I see everyone jumping at the bits there.
Dan, I was just going to jump on Chris's last comment about using smaller chunks.
Yep.
One of the things that helped me, when you do have a rubric type situation, you have your different criteria on the rubric. So one of the ways you can use a rubric in a formative manner is you can do one criteria at a time. So the student creates a project, you have outlined the pieces that need to be included in the project and what makes the best project, and then, you know, goes down the line. So when in that project, if you were talking about choice of graphics, then the student can look at just the choice of graphics. If you look at all of the spelling, or if you look at the content is rich and meaningful and aligned to the subject matter. So whatever your rubric components have, it makes it a lot easier to be shorter and formative and summative at the same time.
Fantastic. Thank you very much there. Truly appreciate your insight there. We do have a question here, and it's in regards to elementary students. And the question is, what have you found to be the most successful online module? And so in this particular case, I assume it's about perhaps a learning management system. What learning management system out there? Maybe when you were speaking that Moodle isn't as effective as for one or the other there, Chris. I don't know if that's something that you want to tackle there and seeing.
Sure. So in my former life, I was a technology director, and I supervised principals and teachers around digital learning. And I was at the core and at the center of evaluating and implementing learning management systems for different schools. And what I'm seeing to a large extent across schools in the country are platforms like Google Classroom being widely used at the elementary level. Other more robust LMSs like a Schoology, a Canvas, a Moodle, a Blackboard that have some of the more advanced features. What schools are showing is that those features are a little bit beyond a lot of the elementary age students and their ability to interact. I'm generalizing, of course, but Google Classroom is a platform that's very simple. And some schools are using like Seesaw, some apps like that. Keep in mind, when we talk about age appropriateness, there's some research around screen time, and there are some very real concerns from parents and educators alike around screen time. So how much learning management system do you really need if you are going to be scaling back on some of that screen time? So keep that in mind. But something that is a little bit easier to navigate, it's a little bit more intuitive for the younger ages. I think that's why we see things like Google Classroom and Seesaw being widely adopted.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. Shea or Nicole?
I think that the learning management system itself is sort of less important than the design that's being employed in the learning management system. So I think you can use Moodle, you can use Blackboard, you can use Canvas, you can use Schoology, you can use Google Classrooms, but really it's sitting down and kind of laying out what it is that you're going to be designing and how you're going to be implementing the design in one of those learning management systems, and just really being very mindful of the clarity, consistency of the design as being crucial for students to be able to navigate what the teaching and learning is going to be all about. So I'd be less concerned about the LMS brand itself and more concerned about the simplicity and consistency of design.
Nicole?
Very quickly, so simplicity and consistency of design is very, very important. And several of the questions have come up here about using the rubric and modeling. Obviously, in a community conversation, that's a little bit difficult to do. But what's very important is kind of what Dr. Shea said. it's just like if you had a textbook as a teacher, you can't rely on the textbook to do all of the instruction, and you cannot rely on the technology to do all of the instruction. It is the creativity. So whatever platform you're using, kind of like Dr. Shea was talking about earlier, you want to have a folder that has, it's an opportunity to differentiate as well, a folder that has several opportunities or different ways that students can get the content. Even if you are not teaching it directly, they can always go back and get more information. It might be a video, a news article, or something, and have that folder ready. And so if they can, you know, give them some exploration time, and when you come back, you can talk. Those are the kinds of design pieces you have to think about as an instructional facilitator in that classroom. It's not the platform. It is, how are you getting the students engaged with the content? And how are you going to get them to understand what the expectations are? And you design everything else around there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those words of wisdom there. I think we are up against our time here. Jerry, if you don't mind, I'm going to turn it back over to you, so to speak, to wrap up, if you're good with that. And then perhaps it looks like some of these questions that are popping up make a great opportunity for us to reconvene here in the next time available. And we would love to tackle on some of those questions there, especially one on equitable learning there. That sounds like a great discussion topic there. But Jerry, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dan. And I would like to thank all the presenters today. Your comments and suggestions are very helpful and very timely here in New York as we begin the new, I call year for schools here in New York. So with that said, you know, we weren't able to address all of our questions. We knew that that was probably going to occur, and I will rope Peter Shea in again, and I will ask all of you to return for a future session to address some additional questions. And I'm sure that there are going to be some questions, particularly in the Northeast, where online delivery or a combination of online versus face-to-face. There are a variety of different models being considered at the moment for you know, for districts here in New York. And so as teachers are grappling and trying out these different models and experiencing challenges and successes, I'm sure that they would love an opportunity to continue this conversation. So I thank you all for your time and your expertise, but please don't be surprised if you get an email asking for a return visit. So with that said, thank you again for all for attending Community Conversations. Please note that next week will not have Community Conversations in light of it's the first week back to school here in New York, but we will resume the following week on the 16th. Until then, be healthy and be happy. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.